everyone, and welcome back. Today, we're going to be diving into some really fascinating research on COVID-19 predictions. We've got a whole bunch of papers, and they're all trying to figure out where this pandemic might go next. But we're not just going to, just read the headlines. We're going to really try to understand the why behind these predictions and what they could mean for you.
Absolutely. And these papers really give us a unique glimpse into the possible futures of this pandemic. And they remind us just how complex it is to try and predict something like a virus.
Right. It's like trying to nail Jell-O to a wall. So the first paper that really caught my eye was this chapter from the book Mathematics of Public Health. They use something called a multi-strain model. And that might sound a little intimidating, but maybe you can help break it down for us.
Yeah, of course. A multi-strain model essentially tries to capture how a disease behaves when you have multiple strains, or in this case, COVID-19 variants, all circulating at the same time. So you can kind of think of it like trying to predict the weather in hurricane season, right? You're expecting the unexpected.
Oh, I like that analogy. That's a good one. So with this model, it's all about expecting the unexpected with this virus. And what makes it kind of unique is that it simulates how new variants emerging could change how the pandemic actually plays out. Now, this particular group of researchers focused on British Columbia, but what they found could really help us understand COVID-19 on a much larger scale.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things about this model is how it uses historical data. So it looks at how variants have emerged in the past to simulate how new ones might pop up, almost like a ticking clock of viral evolution.
Okay, so how does this variant swap actually work in the model? It's kind of like a dance between the different strains.
It is a little bit like a dance. Basically, each time a new variant emerges, the model simulates this kind of swap. So the previous dominant variant takes a backseat and becomes what they call the resident strain. While the new variant steps into the spotlight as the mutant strain, then the model updates key factors like how easily it spreads, or even how well it can evade your immune system based on the characteristics of this new variant.
Okay, so it's looking at things like transmissibility and immune escape each time a new variant takes over.
Exactly.
And those are the two big ones, right? Transmissibility and immune escape.
Exactly.
How contagious is it, and how good is it at dodging our immune defenses? So did the researchers simulate any specific scenarios based on these variant swaps?
They did. They explored two particularly interesting possibilities. First, they looked at what might happen if new variants were less transmissible, but much better at evading your immune system, so less contagious, but much sneakier, if you will.
Okay.
Then they flipped the script and looked at what would happen with higher transmissibility but lower immune escape, meaning the virus is more contagious, but potentially easier for our bodies to recognize and fight off.
Okay, so two sides of the same coin. What did they find?
Well, this is where it gets interesting. Their simulations show that even a variant that isn't as good at spreading can still become dominant if it's really good at evading your immunity.
Wait, really? So a less transmissible variant could still win out if it's better at dodging our immune systems? That's kind of counterintuitive, isn't it?
It is. It really highlights how crucial it is to consider a virus's ability to basically bypass our immunity. We need to be thinking about vaccines that can adapt as the virus evolves and potentially becomes better at evading our existing immunity.
It's like a constant arms race, isn't it?
It really is.
And speaking of vaccines, this research also brings up the very real concern of waning immunity and, what we might call booster fatigue. How did the researchers incorporate that into their model?
Well, they looked at what might happen if fewer people received booster shots. Maybe due to waning immunity or access issues or even just a decrease in public concern. And the results were pretty significant. The model suggests that even a small drop in booster uptake could lead to larger peaks in new infections.
So we can't afford to get complacent, even if we're tired of thinking about vaccines.
Exactly. Ongoing vaccination efforts are going to be key in minimizing the impact of future waves.
So we've talked a lot about this multi-strain model. What other approaches did you find in your research?
Well, one study out of Ireland caught my eye. They use what's called an agent-based model, or ABM for short.
An agent-based model. I have to admit that sounds a little bit like something out of a spy movie.
It does, doesn't it? But it's not as complicated as it sounds. Imagine creating a mini-society inside a computer. That's essentially what an ABM does. It simulates individuals in a particular location, in this case an Irish town, each with their own routines and behaviors. And they use real-world data like where people live, work, and go to school.
Wow, so they're like simulating a mini outbreak.
Exactly.
I bet it's a little bit like herding cats, though, right?
Yes.
Trying to predict how thousands of individuals might behave.
You could say that. Human behavior is definitely the wild card here. But that's what makes this study so interesting. They modeled different probabilities of people staying home when they're sick. And it's fascinating to see how even small changes in that one behavior can create a ripple effect throughout an entire population.
It's all about those little things adding up. So we have these intricate models trying to predict the spread of COVID-19. What other insights did your research uncover?
Well, another paper took a completely different approach, focusing on the genetic evolution of
Hold
viruses.
on, genetic evolution. We're talking about how the virus itself changes over time, not just the spread of existing variants.
That's right. They were really interested in how those tiny changes in the virus's genetic code, the ones that happen all the time, could influence its ability to reinfect people. Even if you've already had COVID, once those mutations could potentially make it harder for your body to recognize and fight it off the next time around.
Okay, so this goes beyond just like the variants we've been talking about. We're talking about these little micro-level mutations that are happening all the time. So how did they even begin to study that?
Well, instead of focusing on specific variants like the other models did, they took a broader approach. They were trying to understand how the overall genetic diversity of the virus changes as it spreads through a population.
So kind of like those branching evolutionary trees we see in textbooks where small variations can lead to big differences over time. That's a great way to put it. So what did they find? What does this have to do with those little mutations and how they might affect reinfection?
Well, one of their most interesting findings was how interconnected communities impact viral evolution. Think about a busy city where people are constantly interacting.
Mm.
Their model showed that all of that interconnectedness, all that contact, could actually increase the genetic distance between viruses circulating in different parts of a city.
Wait, so you're saying that more connections between people, more interactions actually create more opportunities for the virus to evolve in different directions?
Exactly. And here's why that's important. That increased genetic distance could increase the risk of reinfection, even if you've already had COVID-19.
Wow, so living in a more connected community could actually make you more susceptible to getting reinfected.
That's what their research suggests.
It really makes you think about the trade-offs of city life. So we've got these multi-strain models, these agent-based models, all offering these different perspectives on where COVID-19 might be headed. But at the end of the day, they're still just models, right? They can't predict everything with 100% certainty.
Right.
What are some of the limitations that the researchers themselves acknowledged?
Well, all of these models are incredibly sophisticated, but they're still based on assumptions and simplifications. They can't capture the full complexity of this virus interacting with, well, us.
Right, humans.
That's-
We don't exactly make things easy for prediction. Can you give us some concrete examples of those limitations, just so our listeners can understand what kinds of things might throw these predictions off?
Of course. For example, remember how that multi-strain model we talked about assumed that only two variants could really circulate at a time? In reality, we know that multiple variants can be circulating and competing with each other at the same time.
Right, like what we saw with Omicron and all of its subvariants.
Exactly.
That seems like a pretty big simplification.
It is. And when it comes to agent-based models, well, those rely heavily on predicting human behavior.
Which I have to imagine is incredibly difficult.
You're telling me
Hmm.
human behavior is notoriously difficult to predict. Researchers have to make educated guesses about how likely people are to get vaccinated or wear masks or even just stay home when they're sick.
And all of those behaviors can change based on so many factors.
Absolutely. Everything from personal beliefs to what's happening in the news can influence how people behave.
So even the most sophisticated model can't fully account for just how unpredictable we humans can be. Where do we go from here? What are some of the big questions that future research needs to address to make these models even more accurate?
Well, one area that researchers highlighted is the need to better understand how vaccination affects not just the likelihood of infection, but also how infectious a person might be if they do happen to get sick. That's something we need to get a better handle on.
That makes sense. So it's not just about whether a vaccine prevents infection, it's about how it affects transmission as well.
Exactly.
What else?
Researchers are also trying to gather more real-time data on how people interact in various settings to make those agent-based models even more accurate. The more we understand about the nuances of human behavior, the better we can refine these models.
It's all about getting those little details right. It seems like continued genomic surveillance is going to be important as well. We need to keep tracking the virus's evolution, identifying new variants or mutations as they emerge. So much of this comes down to staying one step ahead.
Absolutely.
So for our listeners out there who are trying to make sense of this pandemic and, maybe make some plans for the future, What are the key takeaways from all of this research?
I think the biggest takeaway is that while these models are incredibly useful, uncertainty is a constant. The virus continues to evolve, our understanding of it evolves, and human behavior always adds that extra layer of complexity.
So stay informed and stay flexible.
Exactly.
And maybe don't pack away those masks just yet.
Probably a good idea.
Okay, so we've talked about multi-strain models, agent-based models, even touched on the genetic evolution of this virus. We've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah.
But these models are just one piece of the puzzle, right?
Right.
They can inform our understanding, they can guide our decisions, but they can't predict the future with absolute certainty. So as we start to wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with something to really think about. Given all of this complexity, all of this uncertainty, what factors do you personally prioritize when making decisions about your own health and well-being during this ongoing pandemic?
It's a question we all need to consider. At the end of the day, we each have to weigh the evidence, assess our own personal risk tolerance, and make the choices that feel right for us.
It's about finding that balance. That's a great point to end on. But you know me, I always like to dig a little deeper. In all of your research, did you come across any other interesting approaches to COVID-19 predictions? Anything that we haven't had a chance to discuss yet?
You know what? I did. I did come across this other paper, and it uses something called a synthetic population.
Synthetic population. Okay, now that sounds really interesting. What is that? Are we talking about like simulations with robots or something?
Not quite robots, but it does involve creating a virtual world of sorts. So these researchers in Canada basically built a synthetic population using real demographic data from the 2016 census. And they use that to simulate how diseases spread through a population.
So instead of just looking at the virus itself, they're modeling the population that it's spreading through.
Precise.
And they can use this to explore all sorts of different scenarios, right?
Exactly.
By tweaking certain parameters in the model.
They can. It's a really powerful tool for understanding how those social factors like, age distribution or income levels, even where people live, how all of that can impact a pandemic.
It sounds like those agent-based models we talked about, but on a much larger scale.
It is.
Like taking it from a single town to an entire country.
Right.
That must require a ton of data.
Oh, it does. But luckily, they have access to incredibly detailed information from the Canadian census. Everything from household size to income levels, education, employment status, you name it.
Wow, so they can create some really nuanced simulations with all of that?
They can.
But even with all that detail, there have to be some limitations, right?
Of course.
Hmm.
One of the challenges with something like this is that it relies on historical data.
Hmm.
So if there are any major societal shifts that happen, like a sudden change in migration patterns or, big economic downturn, the model might not accurately reflect those changes.
Because it's based on what happened in the past, not necessarily what's happening right now.
Right.
The future is full of surprises, so even with this incredibly detailed synthetic population, we still can't fully predict how things will actually unfold.
We can't.
And that's important to remember. These models are incredibly useful, but they're tools.
Exactly.
They can give us insights, they can help us make better decisions, but they don't have all the answers.
And they can't predict the future.
Well said. We've covered so much ground in this deep dive. Multi-strain models, agent-based models, we even touched on synthetic populations and the genetic evolution of the virus. And we've learned so much about where COVID-19 might be headed. But I think the biggest takeaway here is that uncertainty is still a huge part of this.
It is.
The virus is constantly evolving, our understanding of it is evolving, and human behavior, well, that's always going to be a wild card.
It is.
But that's the world we live in. So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with this. Stay curious, keep learning, and we'll see you on our next deep dive.